most of us are old enough to remember what we call the Sadie Hawkins dances. Remember those?
Mm-hmm.
Those were where the women would ask the girls would ask the boys to dance. And if you had a Sadie Hawkins night, it's where the girls got to go and ask the boys to go to a date or go to a dance at the school. And those were always fun and interesting because the pair-ups were much different than when the guys would go out and ask the girls to go to a dance or ask them to dance. Um, you know, when I looked at tonight's chapter, Act 3, it's kind of a chapter that develops the character of Ruth and Boaz. Some of the commentaries I read said that the two were too polite with each other to even broach the subject of ever discussing getting married. And in some ways, that's true about them, because if they didn't get pushed into it, we could still be talking about whether they ever got married today. So we're going to look at how their characters had to be nudged a little bit by the matchmaker in order to have Boaz agree to marry Ruth. And it was Ruth that asked Boaz to marry her. It wasn't the other way around. So we're going to talk about Ruth, a godly woman of virtue, and Boaz, a man of noble character. And this reminded me of verse 10 of Proverbs 31. Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. And what we have here is Ruth becoming a virtuous wife by the time we get to the end of the story. So we're going to go in, as I suggested before, each of the books in each of the chapters in the book of Ruth are really acts, and each of them have their own characteristics, but all of them come together into a climatic ending in the 4th chapter, which we'll cover next week. Now, last week we focused on Ruth's actions and character, which God used to draw Ruth into the company of Boaz, a wealthy and prominent man who owned the barley and wheat fields where Ruth gleaned grain. Now, instead of waiting for somebody to help her and Naomi, Ruth relied upon the provisions which God made in Leviticus for his chosen people to provide for the poor, and decided to go out and glean grain from the fields. If you recall, in Leviticus, God said to the farmers, set apart a portion, a quarter of your field, so that the poor can come and gather the grain, and that was a provision to take care of the poor. We learned that God in his providence directed Ruth's steps by having her go out to the barley fields owned by Boaz. It was not happenstance that Ruth ended up gleaning grain in the barley field owned by Boaz. It was not happenstance that Boaz was a man of great wealth, who was also a relative of Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband that died when they went to Moab. We also learned that Ruth's character played an important role in drawing Boaz's attention and favor. In chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, we learned, now Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread and dip your pieces of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her. And she ate and was satisfied and held some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And let the grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. We see that just by her hard work, by what Boaz had heard about her reputation in taking care of Naomi and her profession of faith, as she decided to join Naomi and go to Judah and become one of God's people, he observed her and her politeness and demeanor, and that even gained more favor for Boaz. He almost, at this point, took her in as a daughter instead of just a person that was in the fields that was poor, gleaning grain from the fields. Now, in tonight's studies, we're going to go into more of the character development, and we're going to when in chapter 2, we started with the barley harvest. In chapter 3, we're at the end of the barley harvest. Ruth has been out in the fields gleaning grain for as many as 4 to 6 weeks. And now it was a time when, after the harvest, it was time for the farmers to thresh the grain, and that was to separate the chaff from the grain itself. So we're going to focus on Act 3, and we're going to learn about Ruth's virtue and Boaz's noble character, and how God used their otherwise unorthodox actions to draw them together. Now, this kind of, when we talk about virtue, it reminds me of when Ben Franklin was a young man. He engaged in what he described as a bold and audacious project to achieve perfection by pursuing and practicing 13 moral virtues. Working on one virtue at a time, Benjamin Franklin sought to perfect that virtue through daily tasks, which he designed to develop a habit. And Franklin was a person that believed that if he repeated things for a period of time, it would become a habit, so that he didn't have to second guess himself when it came to these 13 different virtues. He even developed a chart to track his progress as in terms of achieving perfection in each of these virtues. After his death, Benjamin Franklin's efforts to develop perfection in these 13 virtues was published in a book which was titled Benjamin Franklin's Book of Virtues. And if you ever get a chance to read it, and then you compare it to the way Ben Franklin lived in his later life, you would say that, I don't know, maybe he practiced these things, but as an adult, he didn't engage in them all the time. He was quite a ladies' man. In some cases, people believed he was a man's man when he was in Paris, France. Benjamin Franklin did not live out the virtues that he, as a young man, sought to pursue perfection in. But unlike Benjamin Franklin, who felt it necessary to work on the perfection of his virtues, we learn in the book of Ruth that Ruth was naturally possessive, or possessed these virtues, which provide us an example that we can draw upon in our own lives. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that despite the strict conservative morality of the time, God exercised his providence by blessing the unusual, if not unorthodox, plans made by Naomi in arranging for Boaz to take Naomi as his wife. What would otherwise appear as a scandalous encounter, if discovered and brought out into the open, turned into a story of unselfish love between two unlikely candidates who God would use to fulfill his redemptive plan. So, by way of tonight's discussion, in looking at a study of Ruth's virtue and Boaz's noble character, we're going to look at 5 different virtues: the virtue of obedience, morality, submission, loyalty, and patience. And then we'll get into some discussion questions, which should be interesting tonight. So let's get into the study of Ruth's virtue and Boaz's noble character. Let's talk about Ruth's obedience. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, the scriptures read, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?' Now Boaz, whose young women you are with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do.' And she said to her, 'All that you say to me I will do.' So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her." Talk about an arranged date, unusual circumstances. I'm not quite sure if I ever told my daughter to go to where men are working out in the field, uncover a man's feet when he's sleeping, and then lie at his feet, and then eventually, when he wakes up and notices you, ask for marriage. This is really a bizarre and unorthodox way of going about it. We could call this a Sadie Hawkins marriage proposal. Before telling Ruth what she wanted Ruth to do, Naomi told Ruth that she wanted to provide for Ruth's future. If you recall, when Naomi told Ruth and her sister-in-law to turn around and go back to Moab, she argued that she was too old to find a new husband and to bear sons who could fulfill the Levirate duty to perpetuate the lineage. Ruth was saying, I'm too old to find a husband. You need to return to Moab. You're young. You can find a husband there. And she said, even if I were to find a husband, I'm too old to have kids. And even if I had kids, you'd have to wait a long time before they're old enough to give you children that would carry on the lineage. And so Naomi was trying to persuade them to return to Moab. But as we learned, Ruth, choosing God's people, Naomi's people to be her people, and to stay with Naomi, she professed her faith in God and went with Ruth into Bethlehem. Now, Naomi realized that she was not in a position to insist on a near relative fulfilling the Levirate duty of taking her as a wife to bear children. If you really look at it, in the first place, Naomi would have been in a position to seek a husband, to bear children, to carry on the family name. But she realized that she wasn't in a position to do that. So what did she do? She gave that position to Ruth and gave her instructions that through her, the family name and the inheritance would be perpetuated. So instead, recognizing the favor which Boaz had already given to Ruth, Naomi sought to have Ruth ask Boaz to marry her. Because Bethlehem was a small village, Naomi not only knew that Boaz was a close relative who was eligible to take Ruth as his wife, but she also knew that Boaz needed to be prompted to do so. Boaz needed to know that even though Ruth was much younger, she was willing to become his wife. So Naomi instructed Ruth to dress to kill. You get dressed to the nines, child. You're going to go out there and you're going to make a great impression on Boaz after he's been working hard all day. And this is all to entice Boaz to accepting Ruth's proposal of marriage. The time for Ruth to approach Boaz was at hand. After the barley had been harvested, it had to be thrashed. And to be threshed, the grain needed to be separated from the chaff. At the time, the farmers threshed the grain in the evenings when the easterly winds blew across the plains. They took advantage of the natural winds, throwing the grain and chaff up in the air. The wind would blow the chaff away and the grain would fall to the ground. The threshing was accomplished in open enclosures with often stone floors that were elevated above the ground so that when the harvest was pitched into the air, the wind would blow the chaff away and the grain would drop onto the floor where it was gathered into large piles. Threshing grain was a labor-intensive work. When the threshers were done, they would end the day with a meal and some drinking. However, because the unintended grain was piled on the threshing floor, because it attracted thieves, the men stayed and fell asleep around the piles of grain. They often slept with their heads toward the pile of grain and their feet extended outwards, much like a spoke to a wheel. And the men would sleep all around the piles of grain. And in this way, they would prevent it from being stolen. And if you remember, this is the period of the judges where the enemies would come in and they would plunder, destroy crops, and take the grain. And they, especially the Philistines, they really liked to wait until the Israelites did all the work for them, and then they would go in and scoop up the grain and take it. Ruth knew that she was going to approach Boaz to ask him to fulfill the Levirate duty to produce an heir for Amalek's family. And to accomplish the task, she was more than willing to follow Naomi's instruction. Ruth was really looking for a way of going to Boaz and having the marriage arranged. It wasn't like in Bethlehem that Naomi could go like a matchmaker and go to Boaz directly. Bethlehem was a small town. Everybody would be nosing into everybody's business. She had to pick a place and a time that was appropriate where this could be accomplished without putting Boaz on the spot or without Boaz being embarrassed by the fact that he is the one that's being asked for marriage. So Ruth not only needed to maintain her virtue, but she also needed to maintain the appearance of her virtue by being discreet in when and how she approached Boaz, so as not to disturb the other men asleep around the piles of grain. Verse 7 says, "And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down." So there's a lot of discretion here. It's a kind of secretive that she appears. And so now we know that Ruth had the virtue of obedience, following the instructions that Naomi gave to her and following them exactly as she was given. Well, let's talk about the virtue of morality. It was no wonder that Boaz was startled when he awoke and discovered Ruth lying at his feet. Verses 8 and 9 read, "Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled, and he turned himself, and there, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, 'Who are you?' So she answered, 'I am Ruth, your maidservant.'" I can imagine being sound asleep. The last thing I expect to ever happen if I'm out in the field working is that I would be waken up either by cold feet, which Boaz had anyway, and by the fact that I find that there's a woman sleeping at my feet. And then to find out that is Ruth that's there, there's no question that Boaz was surprised. The manner in which Ruth approached Boaz showed her virtuous discretion. Even though there were other men sleeping on the threshing floor, Ruth's stealth in approaching Boaz at night away from the village demonstrated her modesty and virtue in preserving Boaz's privacy. The way Ruth approached Boaz was done in a manner not to embarrass him. When Boaz discovered who she was, Ruth did not hesitate to ask Boaz to marry her. In verse 9, she then said, "Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative." That was a marriage proposal. Taking a maidservant under the wing because he's a close relative was invoking the Levirate rule, where Boaz would take Ruth as his wife to bear children, to carry on Elimelech's family name. Boaz's response to Ruth's proposal of marriage revealed that Boaz had already considered the possibility of taking Ruth as his wife, but that he was unwilling to take his first step because of the age difference, and that he had entirely dismissed the idea that this could ever happen. Notice what you can get from verses 10 and 11. Then Boaz said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." Boaz wouldn't say that to her unless he was already predisposed to marry Ruth. He just didn't know how to ask her. He felt that the age difference was so great that Ruth would never be interested in him. I can't tell me how many times when I was in high school and college, or when I dealt with younger men in the service, they were too shy to take the first step. They didn't feel confident that they could attract a woman that they felt was attractive and that they wanted to be attracted to. Boaz was really concerned about the age difference. He knew that Ruth was virtuous, but he wasn't willing on his own, without a little nudge, of proposing a marriage to her. He did take specific note that Ruth had not sought a younger man to marry her. That speaks not only of Ruth's virtue, but it also speaks of Boaz's interest. If he wasn't interested in Ruth, why would he care whether she went after other men in the town? Why would he be concerned that she would go after another husband? But this just doubled up on Boaz to think, well, wait a minute, Ruth is asking me to be her husband. Boaz was surprised that Ruth was willing to take him as her husband. Some scholars say that Boaz was in his 50s and Ruth was in her 30s. Other scholars say that Boaz was much older, perhaps as old as in his 70s. And so the age difference was not so much of a concern for Ruth, but it was a major concern for Boaz. Imagine the emotions which Boaz felt. He was surprised to find a woman sleeping at his feet on the threshing floor. He was surprised that the woman was Ruth. He was surprised that Ruth was asking for him to marry him. It just, he was taken completely off guard. I can imagine Boaz thinking to himself, I must be dreaming. This is too good to be true. And I think of Fiddler on the Roof when the young man proposed marriage and she accepted, and he sang that song, Miracle of Miracles, just dancing around with joy because he was going to get married to a woman that he loved. Boaz, it's surprising that he was able to keep himself calm and not wake everybody up because he was so surprised by what is happening. The fact that Boaz acknowledged that he was a close relative, but there was another relative closer than him, reveals that Boaz had already considered the possibility of taking Ruth as his wife. With all this surprise, elation, perhaps some confusion, Boaz gathers his thoughts immediately and says, now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there's a relative closer than I. It is likely that Boaz had already decided how he would deal with the other close relative, but they had no idea how to approach Ruth. He can handle dealing with the close relative, getting him out of the way. It's just getting him to have Ruth marry him that he couldn't get to. And so it was Naomi's instructions, her little nudge, Ruth following instructions, being obedient, showing up dressed to kill, dressed in the nines at night, and proposing marriage to Boaz that just sealed the deal. So Boaz says, stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I'll perform the duty for you as the Lord lives. Boaz is almost making a vow of marriage. I'm sure by the way that Boaz immediately took action and what we see in the next chapter when he deals with the other close relative, that Boaz had already had thought through how he would deal with the close relative. He just hadn't gotten to the point of how he's going to get Ruth to be his wife. Now, the next thing is the virtue of submission. Instead of departing Boaz's company, Ruth lovingly submitted to Boaz's instructions to stay with him until early morning. In 13 and 14, Boaz tells her, lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, and she rose before one could recognize another. Then he said, do not let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Again, Boaz is shielding or protecting her from any appearance of impropriety, but he's also worried about their safety. It's nighttime. If she were in the middle of the night with thieves coming through the grain fields to exploit and take grain, he wanted her safety. And so the last thing is he didn't want her to leave. He wanted her to stay with him as long as possible while his heart started to calm down and everything else. There's no reason why Ruth couldn't leave in the same manner as she went out to the threshing floor in the first place. She went out at night. She sneaked in there. There's no reason she couldn't have left in the same manner that she came. Like I said, Boaz didn't want her to leave. More importantly, Boaz was concerned for her safety and her reputation. Lastly, Boaz did not want any rumors of impropriety to be spread, which would ruin or interfere with his plans to invoke the Levirate duty with the blessings and approval of the community. This is a small community. Ruth was a Moabitess, and Boaz was going to ask her to take his hand in, or was going to take her hand in marriage. He really wanted to have the blessing of the community. To further project Ruth's virtuous reputation, Boaz gave Ruth grain to take with her when she departed to go back into the city. Verse 15. Also he said, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, it measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went to the city. We're talking about, as we discussed before, a pretty heavy pound, maybe 40 or 50 pounds of grain that Boaz had Ruth take back with her. So if anybody saw her, she'd be carrying the grain, and they would think that she was out. At worst, she was out just threshing, or not threshing, but gathering or gleaning grain in the field. Now Ruth followed Boaz's instructions, and it showed her loyalty to Boaz. But more importantly, it showed her loyalty to Naomi. In verses 16 and 17, When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "Is that you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, "The 6 assets of barley he gave me, for he said to me, 'Do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" It's like Boaz communicating to Naomi that he acknowledged that she prompted him by sending Ruth out there and by having Ruth ask for the Levirate duty to be imposed. And so he was basically telling Naomi that he was going to marry Ruth and that he would take care of Naomi as his mother-in-law. Finally, we get to the last virtue, and that's the virtue of patience. Then she said, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." Once you're led by God to take an action, then let the Lord work it out. And that's what Naomi is telling Ruth. Ruth was probably all giddy herself about the fact that she was going to get married to Boaz, and they weren't positive that it was going to work out. But Naomi trusted the Lord. And basically she said, "Do not go empty." She said, "For the man will not rest until he's concluded the matter this day." She was confident that Boaz had a plan for working this out, that he would end up taking Ruth's hand in marriage. Waiting for the Lord is a virtue. Ruth not only demonstrated patience, but trust that the Lord would work through Boaz to fulfill his solemn vow. So what we have is a chapter that pretty straightforward. It's not hard to interpret what was going on. But what you see is two people, one of noble character, Boaz, and the other of virtue, Ruth, and how, as some scholars said, they were really too polite to get into the business of asking each other to marry each other. And so they needed a nudge. And we have Naomi playing the matchmaker. And Naomi, small town, she knew enough about Boaz that if Boaz wasn't prompted, he'd never get to the subject of asking to impose the Levirate duty. And so she devised this plan. It's unorthodox. It's kind of exciting. And it's a wonderful love story of how these two people, with a little bit of nudging and the Lord's providence, got to the point of making vows of marriage to each other. We're going to leave chapter 3 or Act 3 and get into Act 4, which is the climax of the story about Ruth and Boaz. And in that, it starts with how Boaz worked the other relative into not exercising his Levirate duty and taking Ruth as his wife. And it also answers next week one of the questions about Paul is whether or not this Levirate duty could be exercised by someone who is already married. And we're going to go into a little bit of what the Levirate duty was and what a kin redeemer is all about, kinsman redeemer is all about. And then we're going to get to the conclusion of the story, which is the whole purpose of the story, is that we're going to see how Ruth and Boaz marry and they bear a child. And so this is all coming together now to a climax, to an ending that's going to be very exciting. But what we developed in Act 3 are the characters of these two people. And you get a sense of how their character and their characteristics were used by God in order to reflect the blessing that came into the lineage of our Lord Jesus through the birth of the child of Boaz and Ruth, down to Jesse, to David, all the way down to the earthly father and mother of our Lord Jesus. So with that, we're going to get into some discussion questions, which will expand our understanding of the character of Ruth and Boaz. By the beginning of chapter 3, Boaz was already enchanted with Ruth. Boaz must have spent a lot of time pondering about the possibility of Ruth becoming his wife. To Boaz, as much as he wanted to be with Ruth, He resigned himself to the fact we talked about the age issue was an insurmountable barrier which caused Boaz not to take any action to approach Ruth. In God's providence, Naomi came to the rescue by devising a bizarre and unorthodox plan to entice Boaz into marrying Ruth. Much like a Sadie Hawkins dance invitation, Naomi told Ruth to dress to the nines and go out to the threshing floor and place herself at Boaz's feet while he slept, and ask Boaz to marry her. Although Boaz and Ruth were naturally drawn and attracted to each other, Naomi's unusual matchmaking plan succeeded. In his providence, God protected Boaz and Ruth's secret midnight encounter from becoming a scandalous and embarrassing situation. And instead, the events of that evening became a comical love story, turning strangers in the night into true lovers. The virtues of Ruth and the nobility of Boaz were blessed by God, who brought them together.
Amen.